Before the world learned to count its own years, there were cities that did not belong to men. Their stones were cut too clean. Their foundations were set too deep, and their purpose was never written in the language of soil and seed, but in a grammar older than breath. Ancient peoples spoke of ruins that felt awake, of valleys where the air pressed heavy on the chest, as if memory itself refused to disperse. They told of places where shepherds would not sleep, where fires burned low without wind, and where the ground seemed to remember footsteps that no longer walked the earth. Yet when the chronicles were gathered, these places were named only as myths. Their builders were reduced to shadows. Their architects were erased, not because they were unknown, but because they were known too well. This was not the first empire, nor was it the greatest in size, but it was the last of its kind. A dominion said to have risen after the flood of judgment when the world was meant to be cleansed, ordered, and sealed. And still, something ancient endured. The stories do not agree on its name. Some call it a kingdom of giants. Others describe it as a refuge or a defiance. But all traditions whisper the same unease. This empire was not built by human hands alone. Its blueprints, they say, came from elsewhere. Not heaven as it was meant to be, but heaven as it had once been, before law hardened and boundaries were enforced. Angels who remembered creation before restraint. Beings who had seen the seams of the world and believed they could stitch them back together. The question is not whether such an empire existed. The question is why, after judgment, after warning, after ruin, someone dared to build again. And so we begin at the edge of what was allowed, where the first stones were laid, and where memory itself begins to fracture. The waters had withdrawn, but the world did not feel restored. Silence lay heavy across the valleys, not as peace, but as aftermath. Rivers wandered through unfamiliar paths, unsure of their own direction, cutting slowly through plains that still remembered pressure. Mountains rose sharp and exposed, their faces unsoftened by time, as if the earth itself had been interrupted mid-creation and left to harden in that state. Humanity stepped forward cautiously into this altered world. The air felt measured. The sky felt higher, more distant. Where once the heavens had seemed open and responsive, now they appeared sealed, restrained by an unseen order that tolerated no wandering. Ancient memory would later describe this age as a tightening, a drawing inward of what had once flowed freely between realms. Stories say that laws were spoken again, but not only to humanity. Boundaries were named for every being that observed the earth. The traffic between heaven and ground slowed until it became rare, then nearly forgotten. What had once been shared knowledge faded into instinct and superstition. Humanity learned to live without expecting voices from above. And yet the giants were not entirely gone. Fragments of record remain scattered and restrained, brief mentions in sacred texts, later traditions passed down in guarded tones, regional legends preserved in place names and forbidden hills. They speak not of the first Nephilim whose violence filled the earth and summoned judgment, but of remnants, descendants born into a changed order, fewer in number, wiser in concealment, alive but no longer welcome. These beings did not rise as kings or conquerors. They withdrew. They settled in highlands where clouds clung low and in valleys where sound carried too far. Their presence endured quietly, marked by stones too large for human hands, by tools that bent ordinary strength, by ruins that did not align with known histories. Humanity sensed them not as rulers, but as echoes, something older, watching from the edges. Fear followed, but not always hatred. In some places, giants became warnings spoken to children. In others, they became explanations for the unexplainable. Why a hill would not be settled, why animals avoided certain passes, why sleep felt restless near ancient ground. But beneath these traces lay a deeper truth, often overlooked. Giants alone could not rebuild anything lasting. They were strong but scattered, intelligent but divided. What they lacked was permission. The new world did not grant it. What survived the flood was not only flesh but memory. Knowledge carried quietly, cautiously, waiting for recognition. And that memory did not belong to giants alone. Some traditions say that watchers remained. Not the bound ones, not those cast down in chains, but observers who stood at a distance, watching a world they no longer recognized. They remembered the earlier design. They remembered closeness. Some accounts describe regret. Others describe restlessness. All agree on remembrance. This was the quiet tension of the post-flood world. It was meant to be final, stable, closed. Yet memory pressed against its limits, testing them gently, persistently, like water against stone. And as humanity learned to live beneath a sealed horizon, something else was learning how to wait. Time moved differently in the years that followed. Seasons returned, but they carried restraint. Rain fell where it was permitted. Winds no longer wandered freely across the earth. Even storms seemed to hesitate, gathering strength only to dissolve without explanation. Creation itself appeared to be learning obedience. Human memory adapted. Stories of the world before judgment softened at their edges, losing clarity with each generation. What had once been spoken as lived experience became legend, then warning, then silence. Parents taught children how to survive, not how to remember. Fields mattered more than stars. Law mattered more than wonder. Yet not all beings forgot so easily. In the distant high places, where air thinned and clouds brushed stone, the remnants lingered. Giants watched the passing of time with a patience that was not entirely voluntary. They aged slowly, aware that the world no longer had a place prepared for them. Their size marked them as foreign. Their strength, once celebrated, now inspired only unease. Some traditions suggest they attempted to integrate, disguising themselves among human clans, limiting their movements and softening their presence. Others say they refused such compromise, withdrawing further into regions no one claimed. Both paths led to the same result: isolation. Human encounters with them became rare, and when they occurred, they were remembered less as battles and more as disturbances. A path blocked, a voice heard in fog, a shadow standing where no shadow should remain still. These moments carried no clear message, only the sense that something ancient still breathed. But the giants were not the only ones struggling with the new order. Beyond human sight, observers weighed the consequences of what had been lost. Watchers, those not bound, not destroyed, stood at a distance, constrained by law but not erased by it. Ancient memory echoes describe them as witnesses to both judgment and aftermath, beings who saw the cost of excess and the pain of separation. They remembered a world that had functioned differently, a creation without sealed boundaries, a humanity not yet afraid of the sky. The Watchers had once moved freely, teaching, guiding, shaping. Now they observed in silence, permitted to see but not to act. Silence, however, is not the same as acceptance. Some traditions hint at tension among these Watchers. Debate, not rebellion. Grief, not ambition. They questioned whether the closing of the world had been a correction or an overcorrection, whether humanity's safety required absolute distance, or whether something precious had been sacrificed alongside the guilty. These questions did not lead immediately to action. They led to waiting. And waiting has weight. As years passed, subtle alignments began to emerge. Giants found themselves drawn toward the same regions, not by command, but by recognition. Places where the air felt thinner, where stars seemed closer, where memory pressed harder against the present. Humans noticed patterns they could not explain, sensing that certain lands resisted settlement despite their promise. The sealed horizon held, but it was not untested. This was not defiance. Not yet. It was contemplation made tangible, the slow convergence of memory, regret, and possibility, a realization forming quietly across generations that what had ended might not be entirely unreachable. And somewhere between heaven's restraint and earth's endurance, a question took shape, one no law had fully answered. If the world had been closed to prevent corruption, what would happen if memory itself became a doorway? The world endured, but it did not expand. It settled into itself, firm and deliberate, as if creation had drawn a final line and chosen to remain within it. Rivers no longer searched for new courses. Mountains weathered instead of rising. The sky, vast and distant, became a ceiling rather than a companion. Humanity adapted to this stillness. Communities formed boundaries of their own, mirroring the order they sensed above them. Laws were written. Stories were shortened. What could not be explained was set aside rather than explored. Survival required focus, and memory, when left unattended, could become dangerous. But beyond the centers of human life, in regions left unnamed and rarely crossed, the pressure of remembrance did not fade. The giants, fewer now, felt the narrowing of the world more acutely than any other beings. Their bodies belonged to an older scale of creation, one that no longer fit the new measure. Each year underscored their displacement. They were not hunted into extinction. They were outpaced by time itself. Some traditions say they mourned openly. Others suggest a quieter sorrow, carried without ceremony. They were strong enough to endure, but endurance without purpose erodes even the mightiest form. Their dreams, it is said, were filled with images of a world they had never truly known, yet somehow remembered, a world without sealed horizons. And still they waited. The watchers, observing all of this, understood the danger of waiting too long. Silence can preserve order, but it can also deepen longing. Ancient memory echoes speak of watchers who felt torn between obedience and compassion. They did not deny the justice of judgment. They questioned its finality. These beings were bound by law, yet law allowed observation. And observation over time shapes intent. They saw humanity learning fear more readily than wisdom. They saw giants fatting without closure. They saw the earth itself bearing scars not just of destruction, but of restraint. Creation functioned, but it did not sing. This was the quiet crisis of the post-flood world. Not rebellion, but imbalance. Not chaos, but compression. Everything held in place, everything accounted for, yet something essential unexpressed. The sealed horizon became more than a boundary. It became a reminder of what had been lost and of what might still be remembered. In later ages, humans would speak of this time as peaceful, but peace achieved through suppression carries its own tension. Beneath the surface of law and order, ancient memory continued to press, searching for form. And so the conditions were set. Not for immediate defiance, not for open transgression, but for an idea, quiet, persistent, and heavy with consequence. The idea that if the world could not be reopened, something might be built within it. Something that could hold what had been cast aside. Something that could give memory a place to stand. As night settled over the highlands and wind traced the edges of forgotten stone, the earth remained still. Rivers flowed. Stars turned. Silence held. Yet beneath that silence, intention began to gather, slow and deliberate, like foundations imagined long before the first stone was ever touched. And somewhere at the far edges of human awareness, the ground itself seemed to listen, preparing for a convergence that would draw the remnants together, not in conquest, but in recognition. Empires are not born in stone. They begin in recognition. Long before the first foundation is marked, before weight is measured or ground is cleared, There is a moment when scattered beings realize they are no longer alone. This recognition does not arrive with celebration. It arrives quietly, like breath catching in the chest, like the sudden awareness that another presence is watching the same horizon. In the years after the flood, this recognition began to stir across distant regions. In Bashan, where basalt fields stretched dark and heavy beneath the sun. In the highlands east of the Jordan, where wind carved its own paths through stone. And in unnamed territories preserved only in fragments, places remembered not by maps but by avoidance. In these regions, remnants began to sense one another. They had once been divided by lineage and rivalry. Clans that had competed for land, for dominance, for survival in the old world now shared a single condition: displacement. The world of men did not welcome them, and the order of heaven did not claim them. They existed between definitions, belonging nowhere fully. Human communities noticed changes long before they understood them. Certain valleys emptied without explanation. Paths once traveled grew overgrown. Hills that had echoed with sound fell silent, as if the land itself had withdrawn consent. Trade routes bent subtly away from specific regions, not by command, but by instinct. Merchants took longer roads without knowing why. Shepherds avoided familiar grazing grounds, uneasy beneath skies that felt too still. Stories began to circulate, not shouted but whispered, figures seen on distant ridges at dawn or dusk, too tall to be human, too motionless to be natural, shapes standing where no one should linger for long. Children were warned without explanation. Elders spoke in fragments, choosing caution over clarity. What drew the remnants together was not ambition, it was a necessity. Survival sharpened awareness. Isolation had become dangerous, not because of attack, but because of erasure. Alone, each giant risked fading into obscurity, remembered only as rumor. Together, they might endure. Ancient writings suggest that some among them understood this more clearly than others. They sensed their own obsolescence. Time pressed differently upon them. Their bodies carried strength, but their dreams carried grief. They dreamed of horizons without seals, of skies that answered when spoken to. They were living evidence of a union no longer permitted, reminders of a design the cosmos wished to correct. And yet they were not alone in their awareness. Other influences moved quietly among them. Unseen but not unfelt, dreams began to align across distant camps. Symbols appeared repeatedly, independent of place. Knowledge resurfaced carefully, not as command but as recollection. Geometry is remembered rather than taught. Astronomy observed rather than explained. Stonecraft understood without instruction, as if the earth itself offered reminders. This was not an invasion. It was a convergence. No banners marked it. No armies announced it. Only a gradual movement toward one another, guided by recognition rather than force. The idea formed among them was not domination but refuge, a place where the unwanted could stand without apology, where memory might be held without punishment. Some traditions speak of a simple mark made during this time, a circle drawn in ash and stone, not a fortress, not a boundary of exclusion, a sign that here, at least briefly, exiles could gather without fear. And as this recognition deepened, a question lingered beneath it, unspoken but shared. If they could find one another, what else might still be possible? As recognition turned into movement, the land itself seemed to respond. Paths that had long resisted travel grew passable. Narrow passes opened between ridges. Springs emerged where stone had been dry. It was not abundance but allowance, a subtle permission granted by a world that sensed something gathering and chose not to resist it. The remnants did not travel openly. They moved in intervals, guided by instinct more than direction. Some came from volcanic plateaus where the ground still held warmth beneath the surface. Others descended from forested highlands where light filtered thin and uneven through ancient branches. Each carried different memories, different griefs, yet all felt the same pressure, the need to be seen by something that understood. They met cautiously at first. No declarations, no counsels, just the distance closed slowly, watched carefully. Giants who had once measured worth by strength now measured it by restraint. Old rivalries softened, not through forgiveness but through irrelevance. The world that had shaped those conflicts no longer existed. Human witnesses remained at the margins. Farmers noticed figures crossing ridgelands at dusk. Hunters found tracks too large to follow, always leading away rather than toward settlement. In some regions, elders instructed their people not to interfere. Let what hides remain hidden, they said, without explaining why. Fear was present, but so was an unspoken sense that interruption would carry consequences. Within the gatherings themselves, silence dominated. Communication did not rely on language alone. Gestures, shared memory, and recognition did the work words once had. When speech occurred, it was careful. Names were spoken softly. Lineages were acknowledged without pride. What mattered now was not what they had been, but what they still were. Among them, some were visibly older. Their movements are slower. Their eyes are distant. These elders carried the weight of memory more heavily than the rest. They remembered instructions, not just commands but patterns. Ways the world had once responded to sound, alignment, intention. They did not teach openly. They were reminded. And through these reminders, something began to form. Not yet an empire, not yet a plan, but a shared orientation. A sense of direction without a destination. Other beings remained unseen, yet their influence sharpened. Dreams grew more specific. The same symbols appeared to different individuals across separate gatherings. Circles, lines intersecting at measured angles. Stones arranged not for defense, but for resonance. Knowledge surfaced not as innovation, but as recollection, ancient memory echoing through unfamiliar hands. Some traditions suggest that these influences came from watchers who had learned caution. They did not appear. They did not speak. They allowed memory to rise naturally, believing this would keep them within the limits of law. Whether this restraint was sufficient remained uncertain. The idea of refuge gained clarity. Not a city, not a kingdom, but a center. A place where displacement could pause, where giants would not need to shrink themselves to survive, where the unwanted could exist without explanation. This idea carried risk. Any center attracts attention. Any gathering creates weight. The remnants sensed this, yet continued, because isolation had become a slower form of extinction. The circle drawn in ash and stone appeared again, repeated across distant sites. Each time it marked a place of meeting, not permanence, a symbol rather than a boundary, a reminder that gathering did not yet mean building. Still, something was shifting beneath the surface. Recognition had turned into alignment. Alignment was becoming an intention. An intention, once shared, has a gravity of its own. As the remnants gathered, and the land adjusted quietly around them, the question they avoided grew heavier with each passing season. If refuge could exist without walls, how long would it be before walls were imagined? The gatherings did not remain small. They were never meant to. Even without announcement, even without design, recognition spreads. What begins as survival becomes presence, and presence alters the shape of the world around it. The remnants felt this shift before they understood it. The air around their meeting places grew heavier. Sound carried farther. Night lingered longer as if listening. Still, there was no single leader, no throne, no command issued from above or among them. Authority, if it could be called that, rested in memory. Those who remembered more were listened to longer. Those who spoke of limits were trusted more than those who spoke of possibility. This restraint mattered. The giants understood, perhaps better than any, the cost of excess. Their very existence was evidence of a boundary once crossed. They did not seek to repeat the past in form, but neither could they accept disappearance as their future. Between repetition and erasure, they searched for a third way. Human presence remained peripheral but significant. Tribes near the gathering regions began to adjust their lives around an absence they could feel but not see. Fields were planted farther away. Seasonal migrations shifted. Songs changed. Some humans claimed the land felt watched, not with hostility, but with expectation. Others spoke of dreams in which circles appeared, drawn on ground they did not recognize. These accounts never reached consensus. They were not meant to. What mattered was that humanity, unknowingly, was giving space. Avoidance became an allowance. The unseen influences persisted, measured and careful. Dreams no longer carried instruction, only alignment. When the remnants awoke, they knew where to walk next, not because they had been told, but because the idea felt shared. This was the most dangerous kind of guidance, guidance that feels like one's own thought. Ancient memory echoes describe this as the moment when possibility hardened, when refuge began to imply structure, when gathering suggested center, and center suggested permanence. The circle drawn in ash and stone was redrawn one final time, larger than before. This time it remained longer. Stones were placed deliberately, not stacked, not sealed, simply positioned as if marking intention rather than claiming ground. Those who stood within it felt something unfamiliar, not safety alone but belonging. This was not yet an empire, but it was no longer only survival. The remnants sensed the risk immediately. To remain gathered was to be noticed. To be noticed was to invite measure, from humanity, from heaven, from the laws that had sealed the horizon in the first place. Yet dispersing again would mean surrendering what they had finally recovered, one another. Some traditions say there was debate. Others say there was only silence, heavy and unanimous. The decision did not arrive as a declaration. It arrived as stillness that did not break. They would remain. And in choosing to remain, they unknowingly crossed a threshold, not of rebellion, but of consequence. What had begun as recognition was becoming the foundation. What had been a memory was preparing to take form. As night settled over the highlands and wind traced the edges of newly placed stone, the land accepted the weight without protest. Rivers continued their course. Stars held their distance. Silence endured. Yet beneath that silence, something had changed. A center now existed, even if it had no walls. And centers once formed begin to draw lines toward themselves, lines of movement, lines of attention, lines that eventually demand definition. Far beyond the gathering, in places where watchers still observed without speaking, this change did not go unnoticed. The remnants had found one another. The next question, unspoken but inevitable, waited just beyond the circle. Where, in a world of limits, could such a center be built without breaking the law that sealed the sky? Every empire chooses its land, not only for defense or abundance, but for meaning. The ground beneath an empire's first stones becomes its first declaration, spoken not in words but in intent. For the last Nephilim dominion, this choice was neither practical nor accidental. It was deliberate, weighted, and quietly defiant. The places they moved toward were never gentle. Ancient traditions consistently placed their strongholds in regions that resisted human settlement long before any stone was raised. Volcanic plateaus where the earth remained warm beneath the surface, breathing faint heat even at night. High ridges scoured by relentless wind, where trees bent low and refused to grow tall. Valleys enclosed by stone walls so steep that sound lingered unnaturally, echoing back altered. as if the land itself were listening before responding. These were not lands of harvest. They offered little water, thin soil, and constant exposure. Yet they possessed something far more valuable to those who could sense it: proximity. Thin places, later peoples would call them, regions where the divide between realms felt closer, not visibly open but subtly strained. Standing there, one felt nearer to memory than to heaven, nearer to origin than to order. Ancient peoples believed such locations retained memory, not memory as story, but memory as imprint. They believed creation itself had been stretched in these places, folded, pressed, or scarred during earlier ages. The ground remembered pressure long after the force had passed. Stones remembered alignment. Wind remembered paths once walked by beings no longer permitted to walk openly. The builders of the Last Empire did not seek beauty. They sought neglect. These lands were chosen because they lay at the edges of attention, places where human presence was sparse and heavenly oversight felt distant, or so the builders believed. The first markings were subtle: no walls, no towers, only measured placements, stones set not in straight lines but in relation to sky and shadow. Alignments traced to stars no longer named, constellations remembered only in fragments. Structures oriented toward solstices and eclipses, moments when light itself seemed uncertain of its path. This was architecture as theology. Walls were not merely barriers but arguments. Foundations were not simply supported, but questions pressed into the earth. To build here was to ask whether order was absolute or whether it depended on constant enforcement. Human communities living nearby sensed the change before they understood it. Livestock refused to graze where the ground had been marked. Rivers altered their course subtly, bending away from new alignments as if avoiding interference. Weather patterns hesitated. Storms gathered, then dissolved. Winds shifted direction without warning. Fear grew, but it was not loud. It settled into instinct. People stopped passing through certain plateaus. They avoided camping in valleys that felt too enclosed. Elders warned without explanation, saying only that the land was no longer as it had been. What made this choice forbidden was not the danger of the land itself, but the intent behind it. These builders were not hiding from heaven. They were testing distance, asking whether there were places where law thinned, whether vigilance weakened at the margins of creation. At the center of these regions lay a particular high plateau, spoken of in later whispers, a place where compasses failed, where stars appeared slightly misplaced, as if observed from the wrong angle. Standing there, travelers reported a faint disorientation, not fear but misalignment. It was here that the first true foundation would eventually be imagined, not because it was safe, but because it felt unanswered. And as the remnant studied this ground, measuring wind and stone and silence, a deeper realization began to form, one that carried both promise and consequence. If the land itself could be persuaded to hold memory, what else might be anchored there? Once the ground had been chosen, the act of remaining upon it became a form of listening. The remnants did not rush to build. They waited. Days passed marked only by shifting light and the long movement of shadow across stone. Nights settled thick and quiet, the stars seeming closer, yet subtly wrong, as if observed from a place slightly removed from the world's true center. This waiting was not without hesitation. It was discernment. Those who stood upon the high plateau felt the difference immediately. Their balance wavered not from weakness but from dissonance. The ground resisted certainty. Direction became suggestion rather than command. Some traditions say that even thought behaved differently there, slowing, stretching, returning in unfamiliar shapes. Memory rose uninvited. Dreams pressed closer to waking. The giants sensed it first. Their bodies, formed for an older scale of creation, responded to the thinness of the place. Strength felt heavier. Breath carried more weight. They spoke less, moving with deliberate care, as if afraid that careless motion might disturb something unseen. Humans who ventured near reported unease that did not fade with familiarity. Animals balked at crossing certain lines, refusing without panic, as if obedience had been written into their instincts. Birds altered their flight paths. Insects grew scarce. The plateau did not repel life violently, it simply discouraged it. This was precisely why it mattered. Ancient memory echoes suggest that the builders believed heaven's attention weakened in such places. Not absent, but delayed. That law, once spoken, relied upon order and clarity to enforce itself. Where clarity bent, where alignment failed, perhaps vigilance softened. This belief did not arise from arrogance, but from observation. It was an inference drawn slowly, carefully, and with great risk. Stone markers began to appear, placed rather than built. Each was aligned not only with the stars, but with the ground beneath, responding to subtle variations in pressure and resonance. The builders listened for echoes that did not come from sound. They felt resistance that did not belong to muscle or earth. This was not the work of giants alone. Knowledge moved among them, not as instruction, but as remembrance awakened by proximity. Some traditions say the watchers did not speak, but allowed memory to surface where it already existed. Geometry returned not as formula, but as intuition. Astronomy revealed itself not through charts, but through rhythm. Stone responded not to force, but to placement. The plateau became a question asked continuously, and the builders adjusted themselves to its answers. As markers multiplied, the land reacted. Mist lingered longer at dawn. Wind altered direction unexpectedly, then resumed its former course. At times, the sky dimmed without clouds, light thinning as if passing through unseen layers. None of this escalated into spectacle. It remained subtle, ambiguous, easily dismissed by those unwilling to notice. Yet for those who waited, the message was clear. This place would allow presence, but not certainty. The builders understood that every alignment risked attention. Every stone placed increased weight. The plateau tolerated them, but tolerance is not permission. Still, they continued, driven by a conviction that refuge required grounding. Memory required location. To remain gathered without building was to invite slow dissolution. To build elsewhere was to invite immediate rejection. This place, thin and misaligned, offered a narrow margin between the two. The forbidden nature of the ground was not defined by warning or sign, but by tension. The sense that something essential was being tested, not violently, but persistently. A question pressed into the fabric of order, waiting to see whether the fabric would hold. As the remnant stood beneath the slightly misplaced stars, measuring solstice shadows and listening to stone, another realization emerged, one less comforting than the first. Choosing the land was only the beginning. To build upon it would require more than alignment. It would require commitment. And commitment, once made in a place like this, could not remain unnoticed forever. The plateau had accepted their presence. But would it accept permanence? Permanence changes the nature of a place. The builders understood this, even if they did not yet name it. To remain was one thing, to return was another. But to anchor, to declare through repetition that this ground would hold weight again, was to alter the conversation entirely. The plateau had tolerated presence. It had not yet answered my intention. Stone by stone, the work began to shift from listening to response. The first foundations were shallow, almost hesitant. Not walls, not enclosures, but reference points, markers that remembered one another across distance. Each placement was followed by waiting. Days passed. Sometimes nothing happened. Sometimes the land answered in small ways, a tremor too light to be called an earthquake, a change in the wind's pitch, a sudden clarity in the sky that vanished as quickly as it came. The builders learned restraint through consequence. Giants moved with deliberate slowness, carrying stones that would have been effortless elsewhere as if they weighed far more here. The plateau resisted haste. Attempts to impose symmetry were abandoned when lines refused to align as expected. What emerged instead was a pattern that followed the land's own distortions, bending where it bent, yielding where it resisted. This was not a failure, it was accommodation. Humans who observed from a distance sensed the change more strongly now. The avoidance that had once been instinct hardened into warning. Entire families relocated rather than remain near the high ground. Oral memory shifted. The land was no longer merely unsettling, it was spoken of as claimed, not by name but by presence. Animals avoided the area almost entirely. Even scavengers circled wide as if the ground no longer belonged to ordinary cycles of life. Silence deepened. Nights grew dense, sound muffled, stars cold and watchful. The plateau no longer felt neglected, it felt held. Some traditions suggest this was the moment when heaven's attention sharpened. Not in anger, not in immediate response, but in recognition. The builders believed they had chosen a place where order was weakest. What they did not yet understand was that weakness draws scrutiny. Law does not always guard its strongest points most closely. Sometimes it watches the edges, where pressure reveals intent. The watchers who observed this work remained silent. If they regretted the convergence, they did not intervene. If they approved, they did not encourage. Their restraint was absolute and heavy. For the builders, this silence was both a relief and a warning. The absence of resistance did not mean acceptance. It meant the measure had not yet been taken. As structures rose, still incomplete, still tentative, the plateau changed its behavior again. Compasses failed entirely now. Travelers reported vertigo when approaching the central alignments. Stars appeared to shift subtly from night to night, not dramatically, but enough to unsettle those who watched carefully. This instability was not chaos. It was tension held in balance. The builders felt it. The giants felt it in their bones. The land was allowing them to exist here, but only just. The margin was narrow. Every addition narrowed it further. Yet turning back was no longer possible. The idea of refuge had taken form. Memory had found ground. What began as survival had become structure, and structure carries consequence whether acknowledged or not. The forbidden nature of the place was no longer theoretical. It was active, responsive, engaged. And still the builders continued, not out of arrogance but necessity. To abandon the plateau now would fracture what had been gathered. To disperse again would mean surrendering the one thing they had reclaimed, coherence. As dawn rose pale and thin over the high ridges, light sliding reluctantly across stone, the plateau held its silence. Wind traced the unfinished lines. Mist settled briefly, then lifted. Nothing stopped the work. But nothing affirmed it either. Somewhere beyond the thin places, beyond human sight and giant hearing, the laws that governed boundaries began to account for what was taking shape. Not as rebellion, not yet, but as construction that leaned too close to memory. The land had been chosen because it resisted order. What would follow was the discovery that order, once challenged, does not remain passive. And as the builders studied the stars once more, adjusting alignments to a sky that no longer behaved as expected, they began to sense that the next question would not be about where to build, but about who had taught them how. The first structures shocked even those who built them. What rose from the plateau did not resemble fortresses or cities as humanity understood them. There were no decorative facades, no marks of conquest or comfort. What emerged instead were forms that felt inevitable, as though the stones themselves had been waiting for permission to stand that way again. The builders paused often, unsettled by what their own hands were revealing. The stones were immense. Blocks larger than any human labor could reasonably lift were moved without visible strain, yet without violence. They were not dragged or forced. They were guided. Surfaces met one another with a precision that suggested intention far older than the builders themselves. Seams closed so tightly that even light hesitated to pass between them, as if the stones remembered a time when separation had not yet been required. Later civilizations would stand before these remnants and wonder. They would measure, speculate, argue. They would imagine lost machines or exaggerated legends. But the traditions surrounding the Last Nephilim Empire tell a quieter, more unsettling story. The builders were not limited to tools alone. Some ancient memories speak of knowledge once used to order creation itself, knowledge not of domination but of alignment. Angelic understanding, preserved imperfectly and applied cautiously, returned not as command over matter but as cooperation with it. Stone was not broken into obedience. I was persuaded. Vibrations played a role, though not as sound alone. Low tones, barely audible, were said to travel through the ground, altering its resistance. Alignments mattered more than force. Placement mattered more than pressure. When the stones were approached correctly, they yielded just enough, as if recalling the conditions under which they were first shaped. This was not magic in the later sense of the word. There were no incantations, no displays meant to impress. It was a craft rooted in cosmology, an understanding that matter responds differently when approached in harmony with the laws that formed it. The builders did not invent this knowledge. They remembered fragments of it. Walls rose that behaved strangely. Sound moved through them unevenly. A whisper spoken at one end of a chamber could arrive intact at the other, while a shout dissipated into silence. Some rooms amplified breath, others swallowed it. Towers were aligned not for defense, but observation, angled toward horizons and skis, tracking movements unseen by ordinary eyes. Yet even as these structures took shape, unease spread among those who worked them. The stones carried weight beyond their mass. To stand near them for long periods induced a heaviness that could not be explained by exhaustion. Some builders reported a sense of sorrow pressing outward from the walls, as if the structures themselves were aware they did not belong fully in this world. Completion did not bring satisfaction. It brought tension. Later legends would describe these places as oppressive, not hostile, but burdened. Ruins that seemed to watch rather than welcome. Spaces that felt unfinished even when intact, as though they were holding their breath, waiting for a resolution that never arrived. This discomfort revealed a critical truth early, though few named it aloud. Knowledge carried from heaven, when removed from obedience, does not produce harmony. It produces precision without peace. The stones fit perfectly, but the world around them did not respond with ease. And at the heart of these constructions lay a particular stone, set deliberately, aligned with care. Some traditions say it hummed softly at night, a tone too low to hear clearly, echoing something ancient. A cornerstone that remembered a celestial order no longer fully permitted to rest upon the earth. Those who stood near it felt both awe and unease. They had built something extraordinary, but they had not built rest. As the structures expanded, the builders began to understand that they were not merely assembling stone. They were reintroducing patterns the world had been taught to forget. Each placement carried consequence, not only for the shape of the structure, but for the space around it. The air grew denser within certain chambers, thinner in others. Time itself seemed to behave unevenly, stretching during moments of stillness and compressing during work. Those who labored closest to the stones reported subtle changes within themselves. Dreams intensified. Sleep grew shallow yet vivid. Memories surfaced that did not belong to their own lifetimes. Images of skis brighter than memory allowed, of voices that carried authority without sound. These experiences were not shared openly. They were spoken in fragments, if at all, because to name them fully felt dangerous. The builders adjusted their methods accordingly. Work slowed. Silence became intentional. Certain tones were no longer used, certain alignments delayed until the land felt ready. This restraint did not come from fear alone, but from recognition. The stones responded best when approached without urgency. Haste introduced resistance. Stillness invited cooperation. Some traditions suggest that the watchers observed these moments closely, not intervening, not correcting, but measuring. The knowledge being applied was familiar to them, distorted, incomplete, yet undeniably drawn from an earlier order. What troubled them was not the skill itself, but its context. These patterns had once been used in harmony with divine intent. Now they were being used to anchor memory against restraint. Within the structures, chambers emerged that served no practical purpose. They were not shelters, nor storage, nor places of gathering. They existed solely for resonance. When occupied, they amplified thought rather than sound. When empty, they held silence with unnatural depth. To stand within them was to feel observed, not by eyes, but by order itself. Giants entering these spaces often lingered longer than intended. Some wept without understanding why. Others felt strength drained from them, replaced by a heaviness that settled into bone. These reactions varied, yet none were indifferent. The stone demanded a response. Human witnesses, when they approached close enough to feel the effects, rarely returned. Those who did spoke cautiously, describing a pressure that made speech difficult. Livestock refused to follow them near. Children became restless in nearby settlements, waking from sleep unsettled, unable to explain what they had sensed. Despite this, construction continued. Not because the builders were blind to the cost, but because stopping had become its own risk. The knowledge once awakened could not be returned fully to sleep. The stones had been persuaded, and persuasion, once accepted, created expectation. To abandon the work now would leave something unresolved, an imbalance more dangerous than completion. At night, the cornerstone's hum grew more noticeable. Still faint, still easily dismissed, yet persistent. It was not a melody. It was a tone, steady, patient, unyielding. Some believed it aligned with a frequency older than the current order of the world. Others believed it was simply the echo of memory reverberating through matter. Whatever its source, the tone carried effect. Stars above the plateau appeared sharper on certain nights, their light colder, more precise. Shadows fell at unfamiliar angles. Those trained to observe celestial movement noticed discrepancies too subtle to prove, yet too consistent to ignore. This was the cost of precision without peace. The builders had achieved mastery over placement, but not over consequence. The stones responded perfectly, yet the world around them tightened further, as if compensating for an intrusion it could not fully reject. Within the unfinished halls, tension accumulated like breath held too long. The structures stood firm, but they did not settle. They waited. And those who moved among them began to sense an approaching weight, not immediate, not violent, but inevitable. The feeling that something had been noticed, that the application of remembered knowledge had crossed an unseen threshold. As the builders stood beneath the night sky, listening to the low hum carried through stone, a question pressed quietly into their awareness. If the stones remembered heaven, would heaven remember the stones? Completion did not bring closure. It brought stillness of a different kind. The structure stood finished in form, yet unfinished in spirit. Walls held, Towers aligned. Chambers resonated exactly as intended. And yet nothing settled. The plateau remained tense, as if the land itself had accepted the weight but not the purpose. The stones stood obedient, but the world around them did not relax. Those who lived within the structures sensed this most clearly at dawn and dusk. In those moments when light thinned and shadows stretched, the air felt expectant. Breath slowed. Sound receded. Even movement seemed to hesitate, as though the place were waiting for something it could not name. The builders began to understand the cost of what they had done. Knowledge remembered without permission does not restore what was lost. It preserves form while stripping away context. The stones reflected this truth perfectly. They were flawless in placement, yet absent of peace. They held memory but not belonging. Like the giants themselves, they existed between orders, too precise for the new world, too restrained for the old. Some traditions say the builders attempted adjustment, minor realignments, subtle changes in tone, new placements meant to soften the tension. These efforts produced temporary relief but never resolution. The hum of the cornerstone never ceased. It remained constant, patient, indifferent to correction. Human presence around the plateau faded almost entirely now. Fear had matured into avoidance. Roots once skirting the high ground were abandoned. Stories hardened into warnings. Children were taught not to look toward the ridges at night, not because something would appear, but because nothing would. The watchers, observing from beyond sight, no longer regarded the structures as experiments. They regarded them as statements. This was not rebellion in the language of war. It was defiance in the language of memory, an insistence that what had once been could be anchored again, even if law had moved on. The watchers did not respond immediately, because law rarely answers emotion with haste. It answers with measure. The giants felt this shift instinctively. Their gatherings grew quieter, councils shortened, conversation turned inward. Strength no longer felt like assurance. It felt like exposure. The very stones that sheltered them now reflected their unresolved state back upon them. At night, some stood beside the cornerstone, listening. The hum did not grow louder, but it grew clearer, not as sound, but as sensation, a reminder of alignment once known, a tone from an order that no longer fully touched the earth. This was the final truth of the stone that remembered heaven. Memory alone cannot restore harmony. Without obedience, without alignment to present law, remembrance becomes weight. Precision becomes a burden. Beauty becomes sorrow. The builders had created something enduring, but endurance is not the same as belonging. As seasons passed, the structures weathered slowly, almost reluctantly. Wind traced their edges, mist settled in their chambers and lifted again. The world did not destroy them, it contained them. And in that containment lay the answer the builders had avoided. Heaven did not need to tear the stones down. It only needed to let them stand as they were, perfect, silent, and unresolved. As dawn broke pale across the plateau, light touching stone that still hummed with ancient tone, the builders looked upward, not in challenge, but in quiet realization. They had remembered how to shape the earth, but they had not yet answered the deeper question. Not how such knowledge worked, but who had taught it to them again, and what that teaching would ultimately demand. Here the question sharpens, not suddenly, but with weight that has been gathering for generations. Giants could lift stones. They could endure harsh land. They could remember fragments of an older world, but they could not have designed what now stood upon the plateau alone. The complexity of the structures, their celestial alignment, their resistance to ordinary physics, their quiet defiance of natural limits, points beyond earthbound origin. These were not instincts rediscovered by strength. They were patterns remembered by instruction. Ancient Jewish traditions speak carefully of such instructors, not inventors of evil but teachers who arrived too early, taught too much, and withdrew too late. They are remembered as the Watchers, beings who once crossed boundaries to share knowledge meant to unfold slowly, metallurgy that reshaped warfare, astrology that bent attention toward the heavens, the reading of signs that collapsed mystery into certainty. After judgment, many were bound. This much is repeated across traditions. Chains, darkness, containment, a sealing away of voices that had spoken out of season. Yet not all writings agree that every watcher met the same fate. Some accounts suggest a quieter failure. They speak of angels who were not dragged into imprisonment, not shattered or silenced by force, but left standing in the aftermath. Witnesses to punishment, survivors of correction, beings who watched their companions bound and the world sealed and were told, without being destroyed, to remember. These watchers did not rebel openly. They did not gather armies or declare defiance. Their struggle was slower, more dangerous. They grieved. They remembered the earlier intimacy between realms, when instruction flowed without fear and creation responded without resistance. They remembered humanity before terror shaped devotion. And they remembered themselves, not as threats, but as guides whose role had ended abruptly. Memory, when carried too long without expression, becomes pressure. These watchers did not descend openly to the plateau. To do so would have been unmistakable. It would have drawn an immediate response. Instead, they influenced indirectly, remaining within the narrow permissions still afforded to observers. They shaped dreams, not commands. They highlighted patterns rather than issuing laws. They allowed remembrance to surface where it already existed. A giant would dream of alignment without seeing a teacher. A builder would wake with knowledge of proportion he could not trace to learning. A constellation would appear meaningful again, not as prophecy but as orientation. Always subtle, always deniable. They taught again, but selectively, carefully, always just enough. Why? Because the intention was not conquest. The Last Nephilim Empire was never meant to overthrow heaven. It was not designed as a rival throne or a declaration of war. It was meant to preserve something heaven had abandoned, or at least sealed away. The closeness between realms. The sense that Earth was not merely observed but engaged. In this light, the angels who taught were not monsters. They were mourners with agency, beings who believed the judgment, though just, had gone too far. That obedience, while necessary, had erased something beautiful along with something dangerous. Their guidance was not fueled by hatred, but by loss, an attempt to hold onto intimacy without reopening chaos, a hope that memory could be anchored without repeating transgression. This is where moral clarity begins to blur. If obedience preserves order but erases beauty, is it still wholly righteous? And if teaching restores beauty but risks disorder, can it be justified? These questions were never spoken aloud on the plateau, but they shaped every stone laid and every dream remembered. The watchers knew the risk of what they were doing. The giants sensed it, even if they could not name it. And as instruction continued quietly, carefully, one truth became unavoidable. Grief, when combined with power, does not remain passive forever. It teaches, and it waits. Grief rarely announces itself as rebellion. More often, it disguises itself as care. The watchers who taught again did not believe they were undoing judgment. In their own understanding, they were softening its edges. They saw themselves not as challengers of law, but as guardians of continuity. The world, after all, still stood. Humanity still breathed. Order remained intact. What they sought to preserve was not power, but memory. Memory of how creation once moved when trust had not yet been replaced by restraint. They had learned from the past. This time, there would be no open dissent, no public instruction, no nomming of forbidden arts. What they offered would come fragmented, filtered through dream and intuition, appearing less like teaching and more like rediscovery. A giant would sense where to place stone without being told why. A builder would recognize a proportion as correct without recalling where it came from. A gathering would orient itself toward a star whose name had been forgotten, yet whose position still mattered. This subtlety was intentional. The watchers understood that overt instruction had once accelerated corruption. Knowledge given too quickly collapses wisdom into utility, so they slowed the flow. They allowed gaps. They let misunderstanding persist where certainty would have been dangerous. This restraint convinced them they were acting responsibly. Yet restraint does not erase consequence. The giants, shaped by grief of their own, were receptive. They had never belonged fully to the new order, yet they were bound to it. The watchers' guidance felt like recognition, an acknowledgement that they were not merely remnants to be tolerated, but beings whose existence still carried meaning. In this recognition, loyalty formed quietly. Not loyalty of command, but of trust. The empire taking shape was therefore not built on coercion, but on alignment of longing. Giants longed for belonging. Watchers longed for intimacy. Both longed for a world that felt less closed than the one they inhabited. Together, they attempted to approximate what had been lost, believing approximation safer than restoration. Humanity remained mostly unaware of this exchange. They felt its effects but not its cause. Dreams grew heavier near the plateau. Some spoke of angels in half-remembered visions, though no names were given. Others felt an unexplainable pull toward the high places, quickly countered by fear. The distance between realms had narrowed perceptibly, but not visibly. This narrowing troubled some watchers more than others. Ancient traditions suggest disagreement among them, not schism but hesitation, questions raised without accusation, warnings given without authority. Was this teaching truly within permission or merely hidden transgression? Was grief clouding judgment? Had they mistaken silence for consent? No answer came. Heaven did not intervene immediately. An absence of response can be mistaken for approval. The watchers continued, telling themselves that preservation was not defiance, that memory was not rebellion, that beauty, once erased, could not simply be mourned forever. But the structures on the plateau began to reflect a deeper imbalance. Precision increased. Harmony did not. The stones responded flawlessly to remembered knowledge, yet the world around them tightened further, as if compensating for something out of place. This tension did not go unnoticed. Some watchers began to withdraw, limiting their influence further. Others persisted, convinced that stopping now would only leave the work incomplete, and incompletion, they believed, was more dangerous than continuation. Thus the teaching continued, not in bold steps but in careful persistence. And with each lesson remembered, each pattern reawakened, the moral question at the heart of their actions grew heavier. If obedience demands the erasure of what was once good, does righteousness require forgetting? Or is there a point where remembrance itself becomes a duty, regardless of the cost? The watchers did not resolve this question. They lived inside it. And as they did, the empire they had helped shape grew more coherent, more distinct, no longer merely a refuge, but a statement of longing pressed into stone. A statement that would soon require an answer. Teaching, once resumed, cannot remain neutral. The watchers understood this long before consequence arrived. Every fragment of knowledge restored altered the balance they claimed to respect. Each alignment remembered, each resonance awakened in stone, carried intention forward even when words were withheld. What began as grief-guided preservation was becoming participation. The empire reflected this shift. Its structures no longer felt merely provisional. They held coherence now, an internal logic that extended beyond refuge. Paths aligned too precisely. Chambers answered sound too consistently. The stones no longer only remembered heaven, they responded to it, as if awaiting further instruction. The plateau itself began to behave less like neglected ground and more like chosen ground. This troubled even those watchers most committed to teaching. They had hoped to preserve intimacy without reopening access, to keep memory alive without restoring traffic between realms. But memory, once anchored, seeks completion. The more clearly the past was recalled, the more sharply the present felt insufficient. The giants sensed this first. Their dreams shifted. Where once they had dreamed of loss, now they dreamed of restoration. Not the old chaos, not unchecked freedom, but something ordered yet open. A world where strength did not isolate them, where the sky did not feel sealed. These dreams carried comfort and danger, longing sharpened into expectation. The watchers recognized the change with quiet alarm. They had not intended to create hope so vivid that it demanded fulfillment. Grief can endure. Hope requires response, and the response within a sealed order draws judgment. Some traditions say a few watchers attempted to stop. They withdrew completely, severing even dream guidance. Others hesitated, offering less, slowing patterns, blurring alignments. But the knowledge already remembered did not retreat. Stones once persuaded do not forget the shape they were taught to hold. The empire had momentum now. Humanity, still largely unaware of its architects, felt the pressure indirectly. Fear around the high places intensified. Sacred boundaries hardened into taboo. Stories once whispered became warnings etched into custom. Entire regions were avoided, not because of attack, but because of weight. The land felt claimed by something unresolved. Heaven, too, accounted for this. Not with thunder, not with immediate correction. Law, when mature, does not rush. It observes until intention becomes undeniable. The watchers knew this. They had seen it before. Judgment follows clarity, not confusion. And clarity was forming. The Last Nephilim Empire was no longer merely a refuge built from grief. It had become a vessel, holding remembered knowledge, preserved intimacy, and unspoken challenge. Not a challenge shouted upward, but one implied by existence itself. If this could stand, what else might be permitted to return? This was the question the empire asked without words. The watchers now stood within the weight of their own choice. To continue teaching would invite consequences they could not prevent. To stop teaching would leave behind a structure infused with longing but denied fulfillment, a wound sealed around memory. Neither path offered innocence. This is the final ambiguity of those angels who taught again. They were not rebels seeking power. They were not loyalists guarding the order. They were mourners who mistook preservation for mercy and mercy for permission. Their failure was not hatred. It was a refusal to let go. As night settled over the plateau, the cornerstone continued its low, steady hum, not louder, not softer, patient, enduring, a tone from an order that no longer governed the world, yet refused to fade entirely. Giants listened in silence. Watchers observed without speech. Humanity slept uneasily beyond the ridges. And somewhere within the layered fabric of law and memory, a reckoning began to take shape, not yet as punishment, but as response. Because teaching, once given, demands accounting. And the next question would not be about who taught, but about what laws had been tested, and how long the world could tolerate a boundary quietly pressed from within. The empire did not exist in isolation, no matter how carefully it was placed at the edges of attention. Stone may rise in silence, but human life is never silent for long. Paths cross, eyes notice, memory spreads faster than walls. Human tribes lived near the high places, not within them but close enough to feel their weight. Some traded cautiously at the margins, exchanging grain, livestock, or crafted goods for protection and access to routes otherwise closed. Others fled, abandoning fertile ground rather than remain beneath a sky that felt altered. And some simply watched, from ridges, from forests, from the safety of distance, caught between dread and fascination. This was not the humanity of earlier ages. They were no longer without defense or direction. They had law now, carried not only in rule but in memory. They remembered judgment. They remembered a world undone by excess. Covenant had reshaped their understanding of safety, teaching them that survival depended not on power but on alignment. Scriptural echoes from later generations hint at this tension. They speak of peoples who feared the sons of Anak, of lands described as devouring their inhabitants. But beneath the language of fear lies something subtler. These accounts do not describe constant attack or open war. They describe unease, a sense that something was not merely dangerous but misplaced. Humans sensed wrongness. The giants they encountered were fewer than the story suggested. Their power was concentrated rather than widespread. Their movements were deliberate. They did not raid endlessly or dominate openly. And yet their empire, vast in stone and ambition, could not sustain itself without human presence. Food, labor, exchange, and proximity were necessary. Even the most carefully aligned structures required interaction with ordinary life. Some humans were drawn in. Protection was offered, knowledge hinted at. Proximity to beings who seemed closer to the divine than ordinary men proved tempting, especially to those who felt forgotten by their own communities. For these people, the empire appeared not as threat, but as opportunity, a place where power felt ordered, purposeful, and ancient. Others resisted. They carried warnings instead of goods, stories instead of trade. They taught their children to remember the flood, to mistrust strength that came without covenant, to recognize that beauty could conceal danger. These warnings did not spread through proclamation but through practice. Routes avoided, questions unanswered, names left unspoken. This tension mattered more than the builders realized. For the first time since the flood, humanity stood not merely as subject but as factor. Their fear slowed expansion. Their refusal denied resources. Their memory pressed against ambition like a quiet barrier. The empire could build stone, but it could not command trust. And trust, once withheld, becomes a signal. As nights passed and watchfires burned at the edges of human settlements, another awareness began to grow, one not yet named, but deeply felt. Human presence was no longer peripheral. It was becoming decisive. As contact increased, the boundary between observer and participant began to blur. Humanity could no longer pretend the empire was a distant anomaly, nor could the builders pretend human reaction was incidental. Each encounter altered the balance, sometimes subtly, sometimes with lasting consequence. Trade routes shifted first, not by decree but by caution. Merchants who approached the high places found the journey heavier than expected. Time stretched strangely. Goods spoiled more quickly. Animals resisted unfamiliar paths. Some returned speaking of silent figures watching from stone ridges, never advancing, never retreating. Others did not return at all. Those who chose to remain near the empire did so with intent. They learned its rhythms. They adapted to its silences. A small number even prospered, protected by proximity and granted access to knowledge that felt elevated, purposeful. These humans became intermediaries, bridges between worlds that were never meant to meet so closely again. Yet even among them, unease persisted. The giants did not rule these humans harshly. There were no chains, no visible oppression. Instead, there was expectation, an unspoken sense that presence implied contribution. Labor was requested, not demanded. Loyalty assumed, not enforced. This subtle pressure proved more binding than force. Some humans found themselves unable to leave, not by command but by loss of direction. Meanwhile, those who resisted carried their resistance quietly. Entire villages relocated under cover of night, choosing uncertainty over proximity. Elders spoke of places that consumed more than they gave. They warned that power unrooted in covenant eventually devours its witnesses. Then came the omen. One village vanished overnight. There was no sign of struggle, no ash, no blood. Fires remained warm, doors stood open, tools lay where they had been set down. The absence was complete and immediate, as if the people had simply stepped away and never returned. Word spread slowly, then urgently. No explanation satisfied. Some claimed the villagers had fled. Others whispered of being taken. A few suggested something worse, that the land itself had claimed them. What mattered was not the cause, but the effect. Fear hardened into resolve. Humanity's memory of judgment resurfaced with clarity. They remembered that destruction does not always arrive violently. Sometimes it arrives as a removal, silence where life once stood, space where presence once anchored meaning. The empire felt the shift immediately. Human trade slowed, labor vanished, intermediaries withdrew or disappeared. The stone structures endured, but the living web around them thinned. The builders realized then that humanity was not merely nearby, it was essential. Without human presence, the empire risked becoming a monument rather than a world. This realization carried weight beyond practicality. Human refusal acted as pressure not only on the empire, but on the watchers themselves. Heaven had been watching humanity since the flood, measuring obedience, trust, memory. Now humanity was choosing restraint over power, covenant over proximity. That choice mattered. For the first time, heaven's attention sharpened not because of giants or angels, but because of humans who remembered when to step away. As night fell and the empty village remained untouched, fires cooling slowly beneath an open sky, the question lingered unspoken across the high places. If humanity would not cross the boundary, how long could the empire stand without them? The absence left behind by the vanished village became heavier than any presence. Days passed, then weeks, and still no one returned. Travelers avoided the place instinctively, skirting its borders as if the ground itself warned them away. Smoke no longer rose. Dogs did not wander through. Even birds refused to land on the roofs. The village remained exactly as it had been left, unfinished meals, cooling hearths, doors swinging gently in the wind, preserved in a moment that refused explanation. For humanity, this was enough. The empire might not have struck the village. It might not have commanded its disappearance, but it existed close enough, powerful enough, and strange enough to be implicated. In a world shaped by judgment, implication carried weight. Innocence was no longer measured by intent alone, but by consequence. Stories hardened into caution. Parents told their children not only where not to go, but why. They spoke of lands that watched back, of strength that demanded too much, of beauty that came at the cost of belonging. Memory, once distant, became immediate again. The giants felt the shift with clarity. Human presence had been a stabilizing force, grounding their gathering in ordinary rhythm. Without it, the empire grew inward-facing. Stone endured, but conversation thinned. The builders sensed that their refuge, meant to preserve life, now risked isolating itself from it. An empire without witnesses becomes a closed loop, repeating its own logic until nothing challenges it. The Watchers, observing this fracture, took careful note. Humanity's refusal mattered more than resistance ever could have. It demonstrated discernment shaped by memory, not fear alone. Humans were no longer pawns between greater beings. They were choosing restraint, even when offered protection and proximity to power. This choice echoed upward. Heaven had not intervened yet, but heaven was listening. Law had been broken before by excess. Now it was being upheld by refusal. The contrast was impossible to ignore. The empire, once envisioned as refuge, now stood exposed as a test. Not a test for giants or angels alone, but for humanity itself. And humanity, quietly and collectively, had answered. The vanished village became an unspoken boundary. Beyond it, interaction ceased, trade ended, paths closed. Silence spread outward from the plateau like a tide. Stone remained, alignment held, knowledge persisted. But something essential had been withdrawn. As dusk settled and the empty village cooled beneath the sky, a realization took shape among the builders, heavy and unavoidable. They could shape matter. They could remember heaven. They could persuade stone. But they could not compel humanity to forget. And that refusal, calm, collective, and rooted in memory, carried more weight than any structure they had raised. The empire had reached the edge of expansion. What followed would not be decided by strength, knowledge, or alignment, but by judgment measured far beyond stone. And as the lights of human settlements grew distant and rare, the Watchers turned their gaze upward once more, aware that the next movement would not come from Earth at all. Empires fall long before they collapse. Long before stone cracks or towers lean, there is a quieter failure, one that unfolds beyond sight, beyond sound. Ancient tradition holds that heaven does not respond to defiance with haste. It watches first. It measures. It weighs not only action but intention, and not only intention but consequence. As the last Nephilim Empire settled into its form, this unseen process began. Nothing dramatic announced it. No thunder split the sky. No voice descended. Instead, absence arrived. Dreams that had once carried clarity thinned, then stopped altogether. Builders who had relied on intuitive alignment woke with uncertainty, unable to recall what had once come effortlessly. Patterns that had guided stone and structure no longer resolved as expected. Angelic guidance did not vanish, it fractured. Some nights brought silence where instruction had once flowed. Other nights offered impressions that contradicted earlier ones. What had felt like remembered knowledge now felt incomplete, as if sentences were being spoken and interrupted midway. The Watchers' influence, once subtle but coherent, grew inconsistent. The stars changed next. Not their presence, but their obedience. Alignments that had held true across seasons began to slip. A constellation that should have marked a turning point arrived late. Shadows fell where calculations said they should not. These discrepancies were small, dismissible to the untrained, but unmistakable to those who had built by celestial measure. This was not wrath. It was a withdrawal. Ancient prophetic language describes heavenly courts not as places of noise but of order. Law reaffirmed quietly, boundaries reasserted without spectacle. In such imagery, judgment is not always punishment, it is clarification, a narrowing of tolerance, a decision not shouted but enacted through restraint. The question being considered was no longer whether the empire should exist. That question had already passed. The structure stood. The gathering had occurred. The issue now was duration. How long could it be tolerated? The angels who had taught began to sense this shift before anyone spoke of it. The weight of their guidance returned to them, no longer as grief, but as cost. Preservation without permission had not remained neutral. It had produced consequences, consequences not only for the earth below but for themselves. They had believed restraint would shield them. Instead, restraint revealed intention more clearly. Among the builders, unease deepened. Work slowed further. Adjustments multiplied. Confidence faded. The sense that something unseen had turned its attention back toward them settled heavily over the plateau. And then, for the first time, one of the watchtowers failed. Its alignment, precise for years, no longer matched the sky. The stars it had tracked refused their places. The tower stood unchanged, yet its purpose slipped away. It was a small failure, but it was unmistakable. And in that moment, the Empire's builders understood that they were no longer unnoticed. Attention changes everything it touches. Once the builders sensed that heaven was watching again, even the familiar began to feel uncertain. Stone that had responded predictably now resisted minor adjustments. Tones that once produced resonance fell flat or echoed unevenly. The plateau itself seemed less cooperative, as though the margin that had once allowed presence was narrowing. This was not hostility, it was accounting. Ancient tradition frames heavenly judgment as measurement rather than impulse. Deeds are weighed, patterns are compared, outcomes are traced back to their source. What the builders were experiencing was not punishment but evaluation, the kind that precedes decision. Dreams remained absent. For some, this silence was more unsettling than any vision could have been. They had grown accustomed to guidance that arrived gently, even if imperfectly. Now they were alone with memory, forced to choose without confirmation. In this stillness, doubts surfaced that had long been deferred. The watchers felt the pressure most acutely. Those who had continued teaching recognized that their influence had become traceable. What once felt undeniable now stood exposed by its effect. Structures carried signatures. Knowledge bore an imprint. The empire itself had become evidence. Some traditions suggest that within the heavenly order, roles were being reconsidered, not rewritten, but enforced. The distinction between observation and participation sharpened. Lines once blurred by grief were redrawn by law. The watchers understood what this meant. Their teaching, though quiet, had crossed from memory into action. They had not simply preserved what was lost, they had facilitated its partial return. That return now demanded response. Within the empire, leaders, if they could be called such, gathered in silence. There were no speeches, no declarations, only shared recognition that the season of allowance was ending. The plateau felt different now, heavier, less flexible. The thinness that had once felt permissive now felt exposed. The watchtower, whose alignment had failed, became a focal point. Builders studied it repeatedly, attempting recalibration. Each attempt produced the same result. The sky refused cooperation. The failure was not in the structure but in permission. Human absence amplified the tension. Without human interaction to anchor daily rhythm, the empire turned inward, magnifying every sign of change. The builders realized that what they had created could not survive indefinitely under scrutiny. Its existence depended on a margin that was shrinking. Still, no force descended. This restraint was itself a message. Heaven was allowing the empire to reveal itself fully, to clarify intent without interruption. The watchers were being given space to recognize the implications of their actions. The builders were being given time to understand what they had built. Such allowance is never indefinite. In prophetic imagery, the weighing of nations occurs before their removal, not after. The scale must settle. The measure must be complete. Only then does the decision follow. As nights passed and stars continued their subtle defiance, the builders felt a shift from uncertainty to inevitability. The question was no longer whether attention had returned. It was what that attention would conclude. And as the failed watchtower stood silhouetted against a sky that no longer answered, a realization settled among those who remembered heaven too well. Being seen again was not the danger. Being understood was. When heaven takes measure, the result is not chaos, it is clear. The empire did not collapse in that season. No stone fell. No fire descended. What changed was orientation. The builders began to realize that they were no longer shaping events, they were being placed within them. The margin they had relied upon, the thin space where action had once passed unnoticed, was closing with quiet precision. The watchers felt it was a limitation. Their access did not vanish entirely, but it narrowed sharply. Observation remained. Influence did not. Where memory had once risen freely in dreams, it now stalled. Where intuition had guided placement and alignment, hesitation replaced certainty. The watchers were being returned to their proper distance, not cast down but corrected. This correction carried weight. They understood then that heaven had not misjudged their intent. It had accounted for it fully. Grief had been seen. Mercy had been measured. And mercy, though understandable, had not been permitted to override law. The watchers' sorrow did not exempt them from consequence. Within prophetic imagery, courts are not scenes of accusation, but of order restored. Boundaries are not punishments, they are reaffirmations. What the watchers experienced was not condemnation, but containment. A reminder that participation, even when motivated by compassion, still alters balance. On the plateau, the builders felt the effect immediately. Structures that once felt alive grew inert. The subtle responsiveness of stone faded. Resonant chambers fell quiet. The low hum of the cornerstone persisted, but it no longer interacted with its surroundings. It had become an echo rather than a bridge. The watchtower, whose alignment had failed, was left untouched. No further attempts were made to correct it. Its silence became symbolic. It stood as proof that heaven no longer answered the empire's questions. This was the turning point. The builders understood that their work had been measured and found unsustainable, not because it was crude or violent, but because it pressed against boundaries meant to remain sealed. The empire could exist only so long as heaven tolerated ambiguity. That tolerance was ending. Still, there was restraint. Heaven did not dismantle the empire immediately because destruction was not the point. Correction was. The goal was not erasure but cessation. The builders were being given time, not to expand but to understand, to recognize that continuation would only deepen consequence. Humanity's earlier refusal now revealed its significance. Humans had stepped back before heaven intervened. They had recognized wrongness without needing command. This discernment mattered. It distinguished witnesses from participation. The empire, once imagined as refuge, now stood revealed as a threshold, a place where longing had pressed too far. It had drawn attention not because it sought power, but because it sought permanence where only memory was allowed. As dawn broke over the plateau, light touched stones that no longer responded. The wind passed without resonance. Stars turned without acknowledgement. Silence settled, not empty but resolved. The watchers withdrew fully now, not in anger but in acceptance. Their teaching had ended. What remained would stand or fall on its own weight. And in that stillness, the final understanding emerged among all who observed. Heaven does not rush to destroy what defies it. It waits until defiance no longer needs to be named. The measure had been taken. What followed would not be immediate collapse, but inevitability unfolding at its own pace, as the empire entered a season where silence would replace guidance, and consequence would replace possibility. Beyond the plateau, unseen but attentive. The order that governs all boundaries had already moved on to the next question. If correction has been given, what will those corrected choose to do with the time that remains? When the end approached, it did not arrive as fire. There was no warning written in flame across the sky, no thunder that split the plateau, no voice that shattered stone. What came instead was silence, gradual, patient, unmistakable to those who had learned to listen for absence. The giants were the first to feel it. They stopped speaking of the future. Not all at once and not by agreement. The words simply failed to arrive. Councils that had once gathered to measure seasons and alignments shortened, then dissolved altogether. Questions about expansion went unanswered. Plans were left unfinished, not out of fear but out of weariness. Some traditions say the Nephilim grew restless in this season. Others say they grew tired. Both may be true. Strength remained but purpose thinned. Without guidance, angelic or otherwise, the empire began to lose coherence. Knowledge that had once flowed, even imperfectly, now fragmented. One group remembered part of a pattern another could not complete. Alignments contradicted one another. Decisions stalled, not because options were unclear, but because meaning had drained from them. Construction ceased quietly. Tools were set down and not taken up again. Stone blocks were left half-positioned, neither abandoned nor completed. No announcement marked the stopping. It simply happened, as if the work itself no longer recognized why it should continue. The land responded. Hairline fractures appeared in stones once thought perfectly set. Not dramatic collapses, just subtle failures, cracks that widened slowly, patiently, with no urgency. Wells that had provided steady water began to thin, then dry entirely, forcing movement away from places once considered central. Even the air felt less responsive, heavier, as though resistance had replaced cooperation. Human alliances, already fragile, fractured completely. Those few humans who had remained near the empire withdrew without conflict. Trade ceased not because it was forbidden, but because it no longer felt worthwhile. The protection once offered by proximity felt hollow now, unable to compensate for the growing sense of instability. Paths closed. Names were forgotten. Memory withdrew before force ever needed to act. This unraveling carried no heroism. There was no final stand, no moment of unified resistance, no cry of defiance toward heaven. The giants did not march. They dispersed. Some lingered among ruins, unable to leave what they had helped shape. Others departed quietly, returning to highlands and distant valleys, carrying the weight of an unfinished attempt. The empire did not fall. It thinned. Spaces between structures grew emptier. Sound traveled farther than it should have. In some cities, echoes began to arrive before footsteps, an unsettling phenomenon noted in later whispers. A voice would return before the speaker had fully entered the space, as if the city itself anticipated a presence that no longer belonged there. This was the omen. A place built to hold memory had begun to outpace life. Streets remained intact but untraveled. Towers still stood but unobserved. Silence did not rush in violently. It settled, layer by layer, until it felt permanent. The giants sensed it clearly now. What they had built could endure physically but not existentially. Without guidance, without humanity, without heaven's tolerance, the empire had become a shell. Not condemned, simply unsustainable. And in that realization, quiet, collective, and heavy, the giants understood something deeper than defeat. Endings do not always arrive to destroy what exists. Sometimes they arrive to make continuation impossible. As dusk settled over stone that no longer hummed with purpose, and wind traced empty corridors where councils once gathered, The question that remained was no longer how the empire would end, but what would be left behind once even the giants chose silence. Silence changes the weight of a place. Where voices once echoed with intention, only breath remained. The giants did not announce their withdrawal from one another, they simply stopped gathering. The spaces built for council grew cold, not from weather but from absence. Time passed without being marked. Days lost distinction. The empire entered a season where nothing new was decided. Some giants lingered near the old centers, walking familiar routes without purpose. They touched stone walls as if expecting response, listening for tones that no longer answered. Others moved outward, drifting toward margins they had once left behind, unsure whether they were returning home or simply retreating from disappointment. Ancient memory echoes describe this as exhaustion of the spirit rather than defeat of the body. The giants had not been overpowered. They had been outlasted. Their strength remained intact, but strength without direction folds inward. Without guidance, power becomes a burden. The empire reflected this inward collapse. Stones that had been aligned with care no longer held resonance. Chambers once tuned to amplify sound swallowed it instead. The low hum of the cornerstone, once steady, faded into imperceptibility, not silence but irrelevant. What remained was structure without conversation. Water scarcity accelerated the unraveling. Wells that had drawn from hidden channels dried unevenly, forcing entire sections of the empire to be abandoned. No attempt was made to repair them. Repair implies expectation. Expectation had departed. Human absence intensified the effect. Without daily interaction, without trade, speech, or shared labor, the empire lost its rhythm. Even conflict had once provided energy. Now there was only one vacancy. The giants realized that humanity had not merely been nearby, it had been a stabilizing presence. Its departure had removed the last external mirror. In later traditions, this period is remembered as unsettling rather than tragic. Travelers who passed near the ruins reported hearing their own footsteps return before they were taken. Voices echoed before words were spoken. Sound arrived early, as if the city anticipated life that no longer belonged to it. This omen carried deep meaning. A place that answers before being entered has lost patience with time. It remembers its presence so strongly that it no longer waits for it. The empire had crossed from living structure into memorial. Giants sensed this with clarity. To remain was to become part of the echo. To stay too long was to risk being absorbed into silence, remembered only as an outline rather than being. Some departed abruptly, leaving behind tools, markings, unfinished thoughts. Others delayed, unable to release what had defined them. No final gathering was held, no farewell spoken. The silence deepened not through collapse, but through thinning, each departure removing another layer of intention. The empire did not resist this loss. It accepted it, as if aware that continuation without meaning would be a greater violation than ending. As wind moved freely now through empty corridors, and dust settled where councils once sat, a realization spread among those who remained only briefly. What had been built to preserve memory was now being claimed by it. And memory, when left alone too long, turns into echo. The final stage of the silence did not feel like abandonment. It felt like a release. Those giants who remained longest were not the strongest, but the most attached. They walked the same routes each day, not to arrive anywhere, but to reassure themselves that the path still existed. They traced the edges of structures with their hands, reading stone the way others once read signs in the sky. Yet the stone no longer responded. It endured, but it did not remember them. One by one, even these lingerers stopped returning. No decree sent them away. No fear drove them out. They simply reached a moment when staying no longer made sense. The empire had become a place where presence felt heavier than absence, where memory is pressed inward instead of outward, where silence answered before intention formed. Some traditions say a few giants lay down within the ruins and never rose again. Others say they walked beyond the high places into regions never recorded, choosing obscurity over echo. What matters is not where they went, but that they stopped shaping anything at all. With their withdrawal, the empire crossed its final threshold. Cities stood intact but uninhabited. Streets held shape without traffic. Towers watched skies that no longer acknowledged them. The phenomenon of echo before footstep became constant. Any sound introduced into the space returned altered, premature, as if the city itself were rehearsing a past it could not release. This was not decayed in the ordinary sense. The stone did not crumble quickly. The walls did not fall. What failed was the sequence. Cause no longer followed effect. Time itself felt misaligned within the ruins. Visitors reported disorientation, sadness without memory, the sense of having arrived too late for something they could not name. The silence of the giants was complete now. They had not been defeated by heaven. They had not been destroyed by humanity. They had not been erased by force. They had withdrawn because continuation had lost meaning. This is the quiet ending ancient traditions struggle to describe. An empire that did not fall but emptied. A people who did not perish but stepped out of history's current. What remained was not a warning carved in stone, but a vacancy that resisted explanation. As night settled over the abandoned cities, wind moved freely through open gates. Stars turned without alignment. No councils watched them. No voices interpreted their meaning. The empire, once heavy with intention, became light with absence. And in that absence, something final was decided. Not by decree, but by reality itself. What had been built from memory could not survive without presence. What had been shaped by longing could not endure without permission. The silence of the giants was not an act of despair. It was an acknowledgement. As the echoes continued to arrive before any step disturbed the dust, the world around the ruins adjusted quietly, closing pathways, softening attention, allowing the empire to slip from relevance into legend. What remained was stone, silence, and the unanswered weight of what had almost endured. Only now does the question answer itself. Not because it was hidden, but because it could not be understood earlier without distortion. Before silence, before withdrawal, before the weight of consequence had settled fully into the stone, only after the empire emptied could its true purpose be seen clearly. The empire was built from angels because it could not have existed otherwise. It was never meant to rule territory or command peoples. It issued no laws, minted no symbols of sovereignty, crowned no kings. Its purpose was not political, nor even cultural. It was ontological. It sought not to govern the world but to define it again, to restate what creation had once been before boundaries hardened and access narrowed. Giants alone could not have conceived this. Their strength allowed construction but not design. Their memory reached backward but without coherence. What gave the empire its internal logic, its alignment, its resonance, its strange refusal to decay into chaos, came from elsewhere. It came from angels who remembered too much. These angels did not build with their hands. They were built with memory, with patterns carried across judgment, with an understanding of how heaven and earth had once spoken without mediation. They could not return to that earlier order. Law prevented it, distance enforced it, and yet memory remained vivid and unresolved. The giants, on the other hand, faced the opposite loss. They could not belong to what remained. The post-flood world had no place prepared for them. Its scale was wrong. Its rhythms did not match their bodies or their dreams. They existed as afterimages of a previous design, tolerated but never integrated. Where angels were barred from returning upward, giants were barred from settling downward. Between these two losses, an alliance formed, not of ambition but of grief. Together, angels and giants created a monument to refusal, not refusal of authority but refusal of erasure. The empire was an attempt to say, this once existed and therefore it still matters. Stone became a memory given mass. Alignment became remembrance given structure. The plateau became a place where an earlier design could be held, if not restored. This is why the empire feels sorrowful, rather than cruel in later memory. Evil seeks domination. This empire sought preservation. It did not hunger for conquest. It hungered for continuity. It did not expand aggressively. It gathered inward, drawing together fragments of what had been scattered by judgment. But refusal, even when quiet, carries consequences. To refuse forgetting is to resist closure. To anchor memory in permanence is to challenge the necessity of endings. The empire stood as a question pressed into the world's surface. Must what was beautiful be lost forever simply because it became dangerous? This question haunted both its builders. For angels, remembrance felt like faithfulness. To forget creation's earlier harmony felt like betrayal of purpose. For giants, remembrance felt like survival. To forget was to accept disappearance. And yet, the world they built revealed the cost of this refusal. The empire could stand, but it could not rest. It could endure, but it could not belong. Its very precision exposed its misalignment. It existed as a memory preserved beyond its season, a song sustained after its final note had already faded from the larger composition. This reframing is essential. The Last Nephilim Empire was not a crime scene. It was a memorial built too early. A monument raised before grief had finished its work. And now, standing amid its silence, the question remains, not only for its builders but for all who remember it. Is remembrance an act of faith, honoring what was once good? Or is it an act of rebellion, refusing to release what the world has been commanded to leave behind? To understand the empire, one must sit with grief long enough for it to speak honestly. Angels are not bound to time the way humanity is. What is distant to the earth can remain immediate to them. The world before judgment had not faded into abstraction. It remained present, detailed, alive in memory. Colors remembered exactly, harmonies unbroken, the ease with which realms once touched without fear. For these angels, obedience after judgment required more than restraint. It required forgetting, and forgetting felt like a loss of vocation. They had not only served within that earlier design, they had belonged to it. To accept the new order fully would have meant accepting that something entrusted to them was gone forever. This is where their teaching must be understood. They did not believe they were undoing heaven's work. They believed they were preserving heaven's intention. In their reasoning, the judgment addressed corruption, not beauty. Violence had required correction. Excess had demanded boundaries, but harmony itself, surely that had not been condemned. So they taught again, not to dominate but to remember. Giants received this teaching differently. Where angels remembered upward, giants remembered inward. Their bodies carried a scale the new world no longer echoed. Their dreams reached for a belonging that no landscape now offered. For them, the empire was not memory preserved. It was identity salvaged. Stone became language. Every alignment said, we were meant for more. Every chamber said, this world has been smaller than it remembers. Every tower said, the sky once answered us. Together, angels and giants built not to defy heaven but to appeal to it. The empire was not a challenge hurled upward. It was a gesture held open, a silent question formed from stone. Is this truly forbidden forever? This is why no throne stood at its center. No god was crowned. No ruler exalted. No law rewritten. The empire made no claims of authority. It made claims of meaning. It argued that the earlier design had value beyond its failure, that beauty should not be erased because it had once been misused. But here is the weight they underestimated. Remembrance does not exist in isolation. When memory is given structure, it becomes a proposal. When a proposal endures, it becomes pressure. And pressure, even when gentle, demands response. Heaven's silence was not ignorance, it was discernment. The watchers were allowed to see whether remembrance would soften into acceptance or harden into insistence, whether grief would mature into trust or crystallize into refusal. The empire answered without words. It endured without yielding. It stood without adapting. It was remembered without releasing. In doing so, it revealed its limit. Faith remembers while still obeying. Rebellion remembers while refusing to let go. The empire lived between these definitions, unable to choose one fully. That tension shaped its every stone. It is why the structures felt heavy, why peace never arrived, why silence, when it came, felt like relief rather than loss. Angels could not return to what they had lost. Giants could not belong to what remained. So they built something that belonged to neither. And that, finally, is why the empire could not endure, not because it was evil, but because it was unresolved. A memory held too tightly becomes a weight. A beauty preserved too rigidly becomes a burden. As the builders withdrew, and the stones stood listening to a sky that no longer answered, the empire revealed its final truth. It had been built from angels not to restore heaven, but because only beings who remembered heaven could have tried. And in that trying, they discovered the hardest lesson of all. Some things are not taken away because they are bad, but because the world that needed them no longer exists. In the end, the empire answered its own question, not through collapse, but through stillness. When the last giants withdrew and the watchers fell silent, what remained was clarity without explanation. Stone endured. Alignment persisted imperfectly. Memory stayed embedded in structure, but no longer pressed outward. The empire ceased asking to be understood. This is the final tragedy. Not that the empire failed, but that it succeeded too well at remembering. It proved that heavenly memory could be anchored in earth, that patterns older than law could still be traced, that beauty once woven into creation had not been erased by judgment. The stones bore witness to this truth long after their builders departed. And yet, endurance alone was not permission. The empire demonstrated possibility, but possibility without calling becomes provocation. Heaven did not deny that the earlier design had been beautiful. It denied that beauty could return unchanged into a world shaped by consequence. Memory was allowed. Restoration was not. This is where the moral question resolves, quietly and without verdict. Is remembrance an act of faith or an act of rebellion? The answer, revealed through the empire's silence, is that it can be both. Faith remembers without demanding reversal. Rebellion remembers and insists on return. The angels who taught again stood at this threshold. Their grief was real. Their love for what was lost was sincere. But love that refuses to release what cannot return becomes resistance, even when it never raises its voice. The giants, too, embodied this tension. Their longing was not malicious. They did not seek dominion over humanity or heaven. They sought belonging. Yet belonging cannot be forced into a world that has moved on. When it is, the result is not harmony but sorrow shaped into stone. The empire was therefore not condemned. It was outlived. Heaven did not destroy it because destruction would have answered the wrong question. Instead, heaven allowed the empire to stand until it spoke its final truth through emptiness, until its builders themselves recognized that remembrance, when fixed into permanence, cannot substitute for obedience. The ruins that remained became teachers in their own right. They taught humanity that power without covenant leaves residue. They taught watchers that mercy without permission still alters balance. They taught the earth that memory can be held without being revived. Most of all, they taught silence. A silence that does not accuse. A silence that does not defend. A silence that simply is. In later ages, travelers would pass near these ruins and feel the weight without knowing why. They would sense sorrow without a story, grandeur without invitation. The empire would persist as an unanswered question embedded in the landscape, reminding all who encountered it that some attempts are noble and still not allowed to continue. As dusk settled over stone that no longer pressed against heaven, the world resumed its quiet order. Rivers flowed. Stars turned without alignment. Human history moved forward, narrower but stable. What had been built from angels remained as proof not of rebellion, but of refusal to forget too soon. And in that proof lay its final meaning. The last Nephilim Empire was not erased because it was evil. It was left behind because it belonged to a world that had already ended. The empire did not vanish. It sank. Not suddenly and not violently. There was no moment the world could point to and say, "This is when it ended." Instead, the ground accepted the weight slowly, patiently, the way earth absorbs rain without sound. What had once stood in tension with heaven did not need to be destroyed. It only needed to be contained. Ruins remained. Walls slumped inward by degrees too subtle to notice in a single lifetime. Towers leaned, then steadied, then leaned again, settling into the posture the land allowed them to keep. Courtyards filled with dust, then grass, then nothing at all. The empire did not resist this descent. It yielded to it, as though understanding that being held by the earth was preferable to pressing against the sky. Names survived longer than stone. They persisted in fragments, place names spoken without context, warnings embedded in idioms, ancestral cautions passed down without explanation. Scriptures hinted without elaborating. Legends gestured without concluding. The story was never told in full, only referenced, as if memory itself had learned restraint. The earth absorbed what heaven rejected. This absorption was not punishment. It was stewardship. Soil closed over foundations not meant to remain exposed. Sediment-filled chambers once aligned to stars. Water pooled where resonance had once traveled freely. The land did not erase the empire, it quieted it. In later ages, only fragments remained. Megaliths too large to move yet too heavy to explain. Stones fitted with impossible precision, now isolated and purposeless. Ruins that drew attention without inviting exploration. Questions embedded in geography rather than text. Scholars speculated. Travelers hesitated. Shepherds avoided certain ground without knowing why. The world moved on. It became quieter, narrower, more ordered. Human history advanced with clearer boundaries, firmer law, and fewer mysteries allowed to remain open. The age of closeness between realms faded into abstraction. The sky became distant again, and earth accepted its role beneath it. Yet something never fully disappeared. The ground is still remembered. Not actively, not urgently, but patiently. Memory remained embedded where the empire had settled deepest, waiting without demand. Later generations would feel it as unease rather than knowledge, as weight rather than warning. Some spoke of a buried foundation stone, deep beneath layers of earth and time. A stone no one could move, not because it was guarded, but because nothing compelled anyone to try. Paths bent around it. Structures avoided it. Life learned its location without nomming it. This was containment. Not erasure, but placement. Not forgetting, but distance. The empire's final form was not ruin, but silence held by soil. And in that silence lay a lesson the world would carry forward, even as the story itself faded from memory. The earth had kept what heaven would not restore, and it would keep it still. Containment is a quieter form of mercy. The earth did not seal the empire away in anger. It did not crush its stones or scatter its memory. It allowed what could not remain visible to rest beneath its surface, where pressure replaces exposure and silence replaces argument. What sank did so gradually, guided by time rather than force. As centuries passed, the ruins slipped from relevance into landscape. What had once demanded attention became something one walked around rather than toward. Roads curved subtly. Settlements formed at careful distances. Wells were dug elsewhere. No decree forbade approach. No sign marked danger. Avoidance became instinct. This is how the earth teaches. Memory that cannot be carried openly is transferred into sensation. Unease replaces explanation. Heaviness replaces history. People feel the wrongness without needing to name it. They learn where not to build by trial and error. Legends followed this same path. They did not disappear. They condensed. Stories once told in full were shortened into warnings. Names lost their narratives and became sounds spoken carefully or not at all. Giants faded into metaphors. Angels became symbols. What remained was not clarity but caution. Scripture carried fragments as well. Not full accounts, but references. Lands that devoured their inhabitants, peoples remembered only as fear, places associated with silence rather than conquest. These were not meant to be decoded fully. They were markers left intact to discourage curiosity without forbidding it. Scholars in later ages would sense the gaps. They would study stones that should not fit, alignments that should not work, myths that repeat without origin. Some would speculate. Others would dismiss it. Most would move on, sensing that resolution was not meant to be achieved. The buried foundation stone remained untouched. Not because it was hidden perfectly, but because it repelled finality. To move it would require intention, and intention never gathered there. Tools felt heavier. Effort felt unnecessary. The earth itself seemed to suggest, gently but firmly, that some things are preserved precisely by not being disturbed. This stone became a boundary without walls. It taught humanity that not all power must be accessed, that some histories are safer when held by the ground rather than by hands. That restraint, once learned, can be passed down without instruction. The world grew more ordered because of this. Boundaries hardened, categories clarified, heaven remained above, earth remained below. Humanity learned to live within the distance, shaping meaning through law, story, and limitation rather than proximity. What was lost was intimacy. What was gained was stability. The empire's memory lingered not as an invitation, but as a warning softened by time. It reminded the world that attempts to restore what belonged to another age carry a cost, even when born from grief, even when shaped by beauty. As seasons continued their quiet turning, grass grew where towers once cast shadow. Rivers adjusted their courses. Stars no longer aligned with buried stone. The world no longer responded to what had been placed beneath it. But it had not been forgotten. It was learned. And in learning, it chose containment over repetition. What the earth keeps, it keeps without accusation. There is no monument marking where the last Nephilim Empire settled into the ground, no pillar announcing its passing, no inscription warning against return. The land does not speak in absolutes. It teaches through continuity, through the quiet persistence of what remains undisturbed. Over time, even the memory of avoidance softened. Later generations no longer knew why certain hills felt heavy, only that they did. They no longer remembered stories of giants or watchers clearly, only that some places resisted settlement, as if the soil itself preferred solitude. Children learned which paths felt wrong long before they learned the words to explain it. This is how containment endures. Not as prohibition, but as inherited discernment. The buried foundation stone remained where it was set, deeper now, layered beneath earth, sediment, and centuries of forgetting. It did not radiate power. It did not call out. It simply existed, unaltered, unmoved, unconcerned with recognition. The world adjusted around it, the way water adjusts around a submerged object, never needing to remove it to flow freely again. What heaven rejected was not destroyed. What earth accepted was not revived. Between these two truths, balance was restored. Human history moved forward without the weight of proximity to the divine. Law replaced intuition. Covenant replaced access. Memory was preserved in story rather than structure. The world became safer if less wondrous, narrower if more stable. And yet the ground still remembers. Not with urgency, not with longing, but with patience. The earth remembers the way stone once answered to alignment, the way silence once held expectation, the way memory pressed too close to permanence. It remembers without seeking repetition. This is the final lesson of the last Nephilim Empire. Some things are not erased because they were wrong. They are buried because they were finished. The world does not return to earlier designs once it has passed through judgment. It carries their imprint forward in subtler forms, wisdom shaped by loss, restraint learned through consequence. What once required giants and angels to express is now carried quietly by soil, by story, by instinct. As night falls over the regions where the empire once stood, stars turn without response from the ground below. Wind moves freely, unmeasured. Rivers flow without alignment. Life continues without reference to what lies beneath. And this finally is peace. Not the peace of restoration, but the peace of resolution. Not the peace of closeness, but the peace of distance rightly held. The earth has kept what heaven would not restore. It has held memory without reviving ambition. It has preserved silence without erasing meaning. And so the story ends where it began, not with spectacle but with stillness. Stone beneath soil. Memory beneath silence. A foundation that cannot be moved, only avoided. The world breathes on. And so the world moved forward. Not because everything had been explained, but because explanation was no longer required. The earth had accepted what heaven would not restore, and in doing so, it taught creation how to continue without reopening what had already been judged complete. The last Nephilim Empire did not end in flame or flood. It ended in placement, in the distance, in the quiet decision of the world to carry memory without returning to it. What had once pressed upward toward the sky now rested downward, held by soil, stone, and time. This is how ancient things truly end. Not erased, not denied, but absorbed. The ruins that remain, scattered stones, impossible alignments, landscapes that resist settlement, are not invitations. They are reminders. No warnings shouted aloud, but hesitations felt in the body, a heaviness in the air, a silence that feels older than language. Humanity learned from this. After the giants withdrew and the watchers fell silent, the world became narrower, yes, but also safer. Boundaries hardened. Law replaced proximity. Covenant replaced access. The heavens remained high, the earth remained grounded, and humanity learned to live in the space between without demanding reunion. Something was lost in that narrowing. Wonder, intimacy, the feeling that the sky was listening. But something else was gained. Stability, continuity, a future not constantly threatened by the weight of memory. The last Nephilim Empire stands, where it stands at all, as proof that not every beautiful thing is meant to return, and not every loss is meant to be repaired. Some designs belong to earlier stages of creation, complete in their time, dangerous if revived too late. Angels learned this. Giants learned this. And eventually, so did the earth. What was built from grief could not outlast grief. What was shaped by remembrance could not replace obedience. And what was anchored without permission could not remain open forever. The Empire stones still hold their precision. Their silence still holds weight. But they no longer demand response. That is their mercy. They exist now as memories without momentum, as testimony without ambition, as evidence that even sacred longing must learn when to release its object. When travelers pass near these places today, if they pass at all, they rarely know what they are sensing. They feel unease without a story, grandeur without invitation, a sense that something immense once rested there and chose, finally, to let go. This is not fear. It is recognition. Recognition that the world has already been shaped by choices no longer available, that certain thresholds once crossed cannot be crossed again, not because they are guarded, but because they are finished. The earth remembers this without bitterness. It remembers the way stone once answered alignment, the way silence once waited for voices that no longer come, the way memory pressed too close to permanence, and then it lets those memories rest. Beneath soil, beneath time, beneath the quiet agreement of creation to move on. This is why the last Nephilim Empire matters. Not because it threatens the present, but because it explains it. It shows us why the world feels ordered yet distant, why the heavens seem silent yet stable, why humanity walks forward guided by law rather than closeness. The empire was not destroyed because it was evil. It was set aside because it belonged to a chapter creation that had already closed. And in that closure, a final truth becomes clear. Some things are not taken away because they are wrong. They are laid down because they are complete. As night settles over the places where stone still sleeps beneath earth, the stars continue their turning. Rivers follow their courses. Human history unfolds with its own struggles and hopes, unburdened by the need to restore what once was. And the ground remains still, holding memory without voice, holding beauty without demand, holding silence without regret. This is the end of the Nephilim Empire. Not as a warning, not as a threat, but as a quiet reminder that even angels must eventually release what they love. And even giants must learn when to step out of history. The world breathes on. If this story stirred a thought, a question, or a quiet feeling you can't quite name, you're welcome to leave it in the comments. Some stories are clearer when shared softly. And sometimes, the earth remembers best when we do too. Sleep well.